as well as being the boss of what I think is still Finland's most famous company. So the perfect guest and the perfect man to try and identify some of these key drivers and key solutions to unlock Europe's innovation potential. Let's just jump straight in. And Jose Manuel Barroso, Risto, the European Commission President, just talked about in his opening address, the future of Europe is science, the future of Europe is innovation. And interestingly, we tend in Europe to focus a lot on what we're not doing so well, but he did describe Europe as the biggest powerhouse of science and innovation. Nokia's success, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been built on constantly reinventing yourself. Could I just ask you, by way of introduction to this conversation, what do you see as the key elements of a sort of ecosystem within a company and more broadly in the economy to create that process of constant invention? And how important is that going to be? How important has it been and how important is it for the future?
Thanks, Jackie, for a very broad question to start with.
I like to start with the easy ones.
The ability to innovate is basically based on the culture of the company. And in Nokia's case, if we take that as an example, I think we have two core values that come from the rural Finland, the national values of hard work and honesty. And then there are two values, core values, that come from Nokia specifically. In the 70s, we had a very visionary leader who pushed through the idea that we need to take huge risks. And when we fail, we don't talk about that failure. We don't talk about the individuals who failed. We just move on. We move on to the next risk we will take. So combining the intellectual honesty, hard work, risk-taking, and not blaming anybody for failures were the key cultural reasons that enabled Nokia to reinvent itself in the past. And we have now reinvented ourselves again.
And indeed, it is fascinating, your history, because I had no idea until I began to do some reading to prepare for today that you started life as a paper mill industry, then you made Wellington boots. At one time you had forestry, cable, power generation, electronics, before you focused. And as you just said...
And you forgot the tires, the rubber boots, tissue paper, and all the other exciting technology products we have done.
And now, as you say, as of last autumn, with the decision to sell off what you're most famous for, the mobile devices segment, to Microsoft, you're reinventing yourself again for the future. Could you just, to give us some context for our discussions, explain where you are now, where the focus for those who may not know will be in the future? How do you see the future as Nokia again goes through this reinvention?
Sure. So Nokia obviously is best known for the smartphones and mobile phones, and we indeed have a wonderful history there. We still have the most successful consumer electronics product of all times, which was the 1100 Nokia mobile phone that sold over 200 million units. I'm sure some of you have had the Nokia 1100 in your hands some 15 years ago. While we have been focused on selling those smart devices, of course the core research that the company has been driving forward has been on the core technologies in those devices, such as imaging, sensors, low power computing, battery technologies, radio, and many other similar areas of innovation. Now we are building on those core capabilities that the company has had for a long time, and into which we have invested some 50 billion euros in R&D funding. So the three continuing businesses that Nokia has are the networks business, where obviously huge challenges will face us over the next 10 years when the amount of data transmitted wirelessly will grow 1,000-fold. The devices connected will grow tremendously. If you think about just connecting all the white and black goods around you, that will be a 10-fold increase in the number of connected devices. If you connect your valuables, I'm talking about the Internet of Things, your wallet, your watch, your keys and so forth, another tenfold increase. And then when you start connecting the smart dust around you, that will be yet another tenfold increase. We'll talk about tens of billions of connected devices. The networks that can enable that number of connected devices, the amount of transferred information, and the number of connections between all those devices will be quite different from today's network. So definitely an area of innovation. And Nokia Networks, the NSN business, is the leader in mobile broadband, which is the focus for that company. Another focus area for Nokia going forward is maps. And map sounds so simple, but what we are actually building is a very accurate, real-time digital representation of the real world. And that is to provide location intelligence, that is to provide context to a lot of things that we take for granted. In the Internet of Things world, for example, you may have a sensor that measures the temperature. It's meaningless unless you know where that sensor is. You need the location to provide context for the data. Only through that context, the data becomes information or knowledge. And the third area that Nokia continues driving forward is core research. And that's monetized through our intellectual property licensing, technology licensing, possibly brand licensing, and new innovative products. So those three areas, all of which are currently profitable businesses and are executing well on their strategies. So we'll change from a mobile device company that is in a very difficult market, loss-making, becoming a profitable business with three areas, all of which are profitable, growth opportunities, and good executional strategy with a very strong balance sheet.
Can I just ask you one question related to that? I want to come back. Nokia has done a study, a comparative analysis of global innovation strategies. I want to come back to the global context later. But one of the reasons behind that, I think, is because the European Commission in an innovation competitiveness report, its 2013 report, highlighted what it said was a tension, if you like, between what Europe tends to do, which is to have a fairly scattered approach, whereas when you look at the US, you look at South Korea or China, tending to have a more strategic focus. But this brought to my mind, and listening to you talk, I hear you saying we now need a new strategic focus. These are the areas we see the potential. But would you agree that generally Europe perhaps hasn't been so great at focusing on where it can be the greatest world beater? But isn't there also a tension between that and the risk if you put all your eggs in one basket, then if that turns out to be the wrong basket, you're in trouble, versus what the Commission warns about, which is do too much, and I quote, you risk dominating none of them. How do you get that balance right, particularly given how fast things are evolving? And you said earlier, you can fail. You have to fail. It's part of innovating. So where's the balance between focus and flexibility, if you like?
Well, governments have a very poor track record of picking what that focus should be. Actually, governments should not even try doing that. Companies need to do that. Governments need to create the environment in which companies can prosper. And that's the role for governments. If we compare the tech industry worldwide, and we divide the tech industry into the 12 most significant subcomponents, sub-areas, and we take the 5 biggest businesses in all of those 12 areas by revenues. So we get 60 companies. Would you guess how many European companies are among those 60? There are 5. There's 1 software company, there's 1 teleoperator, and there are 3 companies in the telecom infrastructure business. So you could ask, how come there's such a concentration of telecom infrastructure businesses among those 5? And the reason is simply because that has been the only area where there has been a large home market in Europe for the past decades. Otherwise, Europe is completely fragmented into islands of different kinds of policy domains, different language areas, different consumer protection laws, and you name it. But actually, when the mobile digital telephony was created, first in the Nordics, some of you remember the NMT, Nordic Mobile Telephony, and then GSM. That created a single market that actually started in Europe and was big enough. And it enabled Nokia, Ericsson, and Alcatel to grow to such degree that even still today, those 3 companies are among the 5 top companies in that field. In all the other 12 areas, there are 2 where we have 1 company. And then the rest, there's none. So my point is just that a single market, the big enough home market, is key to success.
And we'll come back to that because it's very striking. You're again echoing something President Barroso said in the opening when he said we have 28 digital markets. How can we compete? He asked the question very clearly, and you echoing that. That all forming part of this policy environment that we will come back to. But I just want to sort of, if you like, start at first base. You talked, your first answer to me, you talked about the culture. And I understood you to mean it's the culture within Nokia, but it's the Finnish culture. I think you said that. My question, therefore, is to what degree do you believe Nokia's successes, are they replicable? I mean, what lessons can others draw, both from your good times and from the tougher times? Or are there things, is there a limit to the lessons that others in different member states, different EU countries can draw lessons because they are to do with your particular environment, the culture, the policy framework of Finland? Just a thought on that, if you would, just as I say, as part of this context setting. I'm going to come out to all of you soon. I just want to lay some parameters for our discussion. So can others copy it, or is it quite unique to your country and your company?
Well, on the cultural side, I believe all companies need to have a home country, and the culture of that home country needs to be part of the operating model of that company. So it's different for all countries, it's different for all nationalities. It's just important that you understand who you are, you understand how you're different from others. It's not that particular what exactly those characteristics are. Risk-taking and being able to flexibly change your direction are important for all. The single market that we started to discuss is something I believe will continue to be the most important goal for Europe. However, with the globalization, we are seeing an increasing number of fairly young companies that are growing very rapidly that are directly addressing the biggest markets in the world, i.e. the US and China. They have sort of jumped over the traditional first stage of becoming big in their home markets. And that's, of course, encouraging, and we need to continue creating more opportunities for such companies in Europe to get started and to prosper.
That's very interesting. You feel to be a multinational company with no home base simply wouldn't work.
Can you name any really successful large company where you couldn't immediately point to the home country of that company? It's really difficult to come up with any names. Any proposals?
There we are, indeed. No one can. Just before we go on, in terms of the future challenges and the future opportunities, can you tell me how within Nokia you identify, you've come now down to these 3 areas, you've just outlined them for us, where you believe the greatest potential is for the future, which matches your core capabilities. But in terms of foresight capabilities, again, something emphasised in that opening session, how do you do it? Do you have a team somewhere of people who have nothing to do with the day-to-day realities of the business, of the bottom line, of meeting shareholder demands, who just sit and think and have crazy ideas? I mean, it's very easy to talk about foresight, but it isn't so easy to do. How do you come to these conclusions about where the greatest opportunities are and where the greatest challenges are? And as you say, leave a market where maybe the challenges outweigh the opportunities and move into one where you can see enormous potential. On a day-to-day basis, how does Nokia do that?
Well, it's a balance between choosing areas where you want to focus and invest, and then a balance between giving people freedom to do what they really want to do, what they have passion for. I was just in Barcelona at the GSMA event, and the Nokia stand differed from pretty much all the other stands in one respect. That is that we didn't have anybody who was hired to just work at the stand. We had our top engineers, we had our program leaders, we had the people who had actually created the products, and they were showcasing those products. So when you went and asked the guy who was talking about imaging, he actually had engineered the small gadgetry inside the device that took care of when the device shakes, the picture is still sharp. And he talks about that with pride because it's his baby and he's so passionate about that. It's wonderful to talk with these people, and you need to have those people who are really focused on one particular area and they love it above anything else, and they would give everything they have to just make one step in progress in that field. And we have a NRC, Nokia Research Center, where we have about 500 such people, many of them PhDs, and they all have their own areas of passion. And we need to give them the freedom to explore those areas.
Okay, they have their areas of passion, but also sometimes innovation isn't just a new technology, it's a new way of putting together different technologies. So how do you then make sure that all these individual passions, they're not just working on their, as you say, that great advance, that one key step, bring it all together, which will deliver a product? Because I'm thinking here particularly of something we talk a lot about in Europe, the Valley of Death. Or some people now call it the innovation paradox. We're great at having those guys, those 500 guys or gals. I'm using guys in the non-gender specific way. We're great at having the inventions, we're great at innovating, but we're not so great at turning it into commercial products. So how do you then link all that talent and skill and great ideas together to come up with the great Nokia products of the future?
Well, first of all, it's clear that in Europe we have this gap between small companies, small startups, and then the very large companies. And the Nordic countries are a great example in a bad way of that, where if you think about the Nordic countries, we lead the world in the number of patents per capita, in the quality of education, scientific research, amount of R&D investments per capita, and so forth and so forth. Yet, most of our people are employed by companies that are over 100 years old. The vast majority of the people in the Nordic countries are employed by very large, very old companies. And there's something behind this that people don't really understand. Why can't we grow new, very large companies? While that's going on in the US, for example, and China all the time.
And your answer is?
Well, one answer is definitely the large home market that we have discussed, because it slows down and hinders that growth process in so many different ways. And when those factors mount up, it becomes really difficult to grow and sort of bridge the gap that we discussed. But companies are doing that by jumping over the European market and addressing the big single markets immediately. But I still believe that the biggest single opportunity for Europe is the creation of the single market.
Thank you. I want to come back to that whole policy environment, but just a question related. I mentioned earlier, and you said to me when we met this morning, I consider myself an entrepreneur. That is what I am. And these 40 startups that you have invested in as a business angel, what for you characterises the one? I mean, how many of them have succeeded of those 40? Have any failed completely, gone out of business?
Yes, several have failed.
Several have. And of those that are most successful, maybe more on this route to becoming the big company, what is the key characteristic of them? Can you identify something in their DNA that says that is a company that not only innovates, knows how to make money out of it, and is going places? As a business angel, what do you look for and what do you see later on? And then I'm going to come out to all of you, and then we'll come back on the policy issues a little bit later. Please, just on that.
Yeah, when I started my business angel career, I was naive enough to believe that I can find good people around a great idea. So I started looking for great ideas, and I never got the greatest people around great ideas. So the traditional wisdom of the VC industry is that you always look for the great teams and the idea is secondary, because the greatest teams can always find new ideas. And that is actually the way forward that works. So nowadays, I only look for great teams, and the answer to your question, what is the one defining characteristic? It's the entrepreneur or entrepreneurs in the company. Really, that one individual or those few individuals will make all the difference.
Okay, so it's not the economy stupid, it's the people stupid.
It's the people.
Okay, as I say, I want to come back and talk about this ecosystem. You've talked a lot about the single market already, but all the different elements we talk about within a company, broaden that out and talk about that policy environment that we need more generally. But before we do that, I also want to bring in, and just for your information, Nokia has completed this study comparing global innovation strategies, looking at some of our greatest rivals and trying to analyse what they're doing right, what we can learn from. Come back to that global context as well, because obviously it's so important today. But before I do that, does anybody want to come in with a question or a comment to... It's all right, there isn't a hand up at the moment, I don't think, at the back there. Let's have a look. Anybody? Or are you happy for me to go on grilling? Now, we have a slight challenge in this room, ladies and gentlemen, which is that those in the middle, and I always dread thinking, please don't anyone right in the middle put their hand up, because getting a microphone to them is almost impossible. If you wouldn't mind, we're going to work as a team. We've heard a lot already about collaboration. Please, sir, and please introduce yourself and say where you're from.
Thank you very much. Kim Smouter from ESMR, the World Association for Market, Social and Opinion Research. I wanted to kind of pick up your point about the single market, the European single market. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about kind of the cultural challenges which are inherent with that. So companies blame often the legislative framework as being the problem, but actually to have 28 markets would also be very helpful to have a single language or to have a single approach to culture, to have a single way of advertising and getting the same message out, which of course Europe can't do. So what would be your advice to address kind of the cultural challenge of creating a single European cultural space which can be marketed to?
Okay, thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind passing that mic down. Any others related to that? Or indeed to anyone else. And yes, it's all going to be people right in the middle today. If you wouldn't mind, sorry, can you put your hand up again, sir, so I can see you? There we are. Could you please pass it down the line? Thank you very much. Please.
Oh, I see. Sorry. You're going to ask many questions, the public to ask many questions, and then I see. Okay, I got the message. Professor Linson from the MNRC Newport Network. I'm very inspired by the title "Global Leader Session," led by Nokia. But Europe has an enormous potential, but it is ruining its chances because of its inability to integrate. An enormous amount of money, energy, and time is wasted because of fragmentation, lack of long-term vision, and chronic internal dysfunction. Our team, we were very disappointed by President Barroso and his team, and we are looking forward to their departure and looking forward for the new team. Europe needs a leader who can simplify the complexities of the European institutions and who can also propose a new global governance, including new European governance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If you could pass that back. So two there really relating to, could I just ask you to come down? There's a lady over there. I can't get there quickly enough. Could you raise your hand again? She's coming to you with the mic from that side. I am indeed taking a group of questions in the interest of time, and then I'll give Risto a chance to respond, and then I'll come out again. Please, madam, over to you.
Okay, good morning, sir. I have a question, actually, because I'm very interested in the role of the government in supporting innovative economy, and I wonder what is your personal opinion about the role of Finnish government, I know in case of Nokia or other companies, and if you consider it as a benchmark and good example, I wonder what could be the tips that other fragmented market governments could learn from your national country.
Thank you very much.
So this is my question.
Thank you. And that raises an interesting question also about the links between what is done at European level, and we've heard very much an echo of what you were saying in terms of a single market, not just legislatively, but culturally speaking, of avoiding fragmentation, but also how do you get the joined up thinking? For example, EU funding. We've heard a lot this morning already about the increase in funding for research and innovation, joined up between the sides. So in terms of the policy environment, if I could link those questions together, how do you create the best possible environment? How do you see the role of the EU in all of this? And how do you see the role of the national level and the Finnish example, as was asked there, as a lesson for others, and the link between the two?
Well, it's interesting that so many of the questions related to the culture and creating a single European culture, which obviously is impossible. If you think about the US and ask any Californian whether the New Yorkers are similar to the Californians, they will all say that absolutely not, and they are a little bit offended by the question. If you ask the New Yorkers the same question in reverse, they say the same. They're not same, they're very different. And if you have been to Texas, you know that they are very different. And the same applies to Europe. And there's nothing bad in that, but you can still have a single market. But it requires all of us to give something up. And you know this old story of why there are so many official languages in Europe. Because everybody is basically agreed that English could be the one shared language across Europe, except the French. But everybody agrees that English and French could be the official languages, except the Germans. And it goes on and on until we have 28 official languages. So we all need to be prepared to give something up as well in order to gain the benefits. The question about what can the governments do, I think the main wisdom that I have learned over the past years of dealing with governments and trying to help them here is that they need to lean more on private enterprises to lead. And what I mean with this is that governments should not be passing money to companies. Governments should find private entrepreneur-led businesses, i.e. venture capital companies, different types of funds, that will have their own stake in the results to pass that money on to portfolio companies. And you can do this in a really smart way by establishing asymmetric funds. Funds where, as an example, the private investments into a fund are matched by the government, but in an asymmetric way where the private investors will be paid their investments back first when the fund starts making exits, which means that the IRR for the private investors will be better than for the public money. And this will attract private investors to invest in funds that target startups. But that fund will have an entrepreneurial stake in the success of those companies, rather than civil servants trying to find the best companies. I mean, how can you even hire successful serial entrepreneurs as civil servants? But you can have serial entrepreneurs establishing funds to support new startups, because many serial entrepreneurs have that as their passion. That's what they love doing.
But that leverage effect, that catalyst effect of national EU funding is important.
Exactly.
And has been important for GSM technology and other things like that.
And you can use that as a lever to get actually more by making these asymmetric structures.
Okay, so aside from the funding, and there was a question there about the legislative framework and said, what about the language? But in terms of the legislative framework, how important has telecoms liberalisation across Europe been? How important are the efforts at standardisation, issues like that? And indeed, I mean, the financing aside, but all these harmonisation, standardisation and so on, how important for you are those elements of the policy framework taking into account what you said then about, yes, and then governments need to let us basically do what we're good at, rather than trying to pick the winners or interfere. But that ecosystem, that environment, and crucially, if I could add to that, because it's a policymaker role, the education system. Because I think in Finland, I have read that not only do you have I think you're the biggest investor in R&D as a proportion of your GDP, but your education system is becoming more and more entrepreneurial. So those other elements, apart from the money, what's most important at European and national level?
Let me comment on the telecommunications sector briefly, because it's actually quite interesting. Comparing Europe, China, and the US. In China, they have 4 or 5 operators, so 300 million subscribers on average per operator. In the US, they have 4 or 5 operators for 300 million people. In Europe, we have 200 plus operators for 500 million. Completely fragmented market. So what's happening as a result of regulation, actually? Over the past few years, in the United States, operator investments are up 70%, and operator revenues are up 40%. In Europe, operator investments are flat, and operator revenues are down. And we all know what's happening for the overall environment where we all work if there's no investment or no growth of investment into the digital infrastructure. And in the United States, growth of 70% versus flat in Europe. And by the actions of the European regulators that prioritize minimizing prices to consumers, and there's nothing wrong about that. That's quite good. But if you are single-mindedly focused on that, it leaves no room for increasing investments. In the United States, the operators have been allowed to grow as a result of these significant investments. And that is creating a better environment for all companies and consumers to work in. So a completely different approach. In the United States, prioritizing investment and innovation. In Europe, prioritizing minimizing prices for consumers. And a different result.
Interesting there that you also emphasise investing in the infrastructure, because we tend to focus on the figure for R&D alone. And of course, 2 elements to the EU budget for the next 7 years. One, indeed, that big increase, significant increase in funding for research and innovation. But the other great innovation, the Connecting Europe facility, which included broadband and so on. Yes, there is more money than there was, because there wasn't a pot at all before, but much less than the Commission was calling for. So do we sometimes perhaps over-focus just on the research side and not enough on the necessary infrastructures to go with that? And if so, is that again a role for Europe to highlight to member states why we need to do both at the same time?
I think it's all a question of incentives to invest. We need incentives to invest. We need those incentives for the operators. We need those incentives for private individuals as business angels, and we need those incentives for, say, the pension funds to invest in the startups and the growth companies of their home markets, their home countries. And that will benefit all of Europe.
You gave an example there from the telecom sector about the fragmentation, but that aside, when we look at the global context, just a couple of questions in relation to that. Firstly, do you share the criticism of those who sometimes say Europe is very good at talking to itself and navel-gazing and focusing on European comparisons between different countries within Europe, our innovation scoreboards and so on? We look at how we're doing relative to each other, how our regions are doing, and still, despite globalization, despite the competition coming from outside, not so good at looking at the global context. And within that, and in terms of the study that you've done, and I see you have some copies there with you on the table, what do we learn about how good we are at the moment, how effective our innovation strategies are compared with those of our greatest competitors, particularly in your sector?
Well, I'm personally extremely concerned. I think we we have a risk of becoming an outdoors museum for visiting Chinese tourists. And that's not the kind of future that I want for my kids. The investment and innovation cultures around Europe are very different, again, from each other. I don't think we are sufficiently sharing best practices. I think we are trying to do too much by the government, too much by civil servants, rather than getting entrepreneurially led companies to do those things on the government's behalf, supplying them with the right incentives. In the US, say the biggest government-funded investment vehicle, which is focused on truly advanced research, sort of these crazy ideas that are really far-fetched, is the body that came up with the internet originally and so forth and so forth. That's the kind of investment that governments can provide directly. But then anything that tries to apply that core research should be private controlled by people who have a stake in the outcome, while they can be publicly funded.
Okay, let's go out and take a few more questions if there are any. I want to come back on the people, because you talked about, when I asked you what's in the DNA of a successful startup, it's all about the people. I want to come back on them, but let's take a few more first. Please, sir. Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah, you should just talk, they'll pick you up.
Okay, hello.
There you go.
Can you please tell me what you feel a good entrepreneur is? So when you make your personal investments for your venture capital fund or for your angel fund, what do you see, okay, maybe not the idea, but what requirements do they need to have for him or her to be a good entrepreneur?
Okay, so how do you identify them when you've got them in front of you, when you're doing your equivalent of, for those who know the British programme, Dragon's Den? Other questions or comments at this point? There's one, yes, if you could take the lady at the back there, please. Thank you very much.
Hi. You mentioned before the way you conduct or drive innovation in Nokia is through the Nokia Research Center. Could you please expand a bit more on how actually decisions are made on what to do in the future in terms of the innovation?
Okay, so we talked about how you generate the ideas. There's another one, madam. Could you just pass, sorry, could you give it back to her? And then could you pass it right back to the gentleman behind you? That's the only way we're going to get there. Gentleman with the white hair there. Sorry, bear with us. Thank you so much. Please, sir.
Consider venture capital. You are business angel. How do you see the EU policy in venture capital? I personally wanted to be more venture capital business angel here in the European Convention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more before I come back? Yes, please, madam, if you could pass that behind you. Thank you very much.
Hello. My question is, in your view, how important are corporations, and how would you then foster them, or what is important there?
What sort of corporations are you thinking about? Between
corporations in innovation sector, so
right.
With
so between
R&D.
Industry and academia and policymakers, or internationally, or both?
Between small and medium-sized companies, and between, let's say, academia and industry.
Okay, so it's those alliances that you see as so important. The triple helix question. One more, and then, sorry, let me just climb over here, and around we go, and then I'll come back to Risto. Please, madam. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have one comment and one question. The first comment is just, we hear a lot about Europe on the negative side, in terms of culture, fragmentation of the market. Don't you think there are also positive aspects in terms of social policies, well-being, that can be also steps for innovation? And the second question, don't you think that innovation and research take time, and that's maybe also something that we want direct results? Don't you think that all this knowledge takes time and long-term investment?
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, particularly in a sector like yours, Risto, you don't have much time because it moves so fast. So how do you... if I could ask you to hold the question about what makes a good entrepreneur, because I want to come back to that and broaden it a little bit, if I might, but pick up on the other points first. So you talked about how you generate the good ideas. How do you decide was one of the questions. How do you build the alliances? Because I think those two are really really linked with industry and academia, and how important is that? And then this question of the venture capital. I think the others were more the broad question, but how do you keep pace with the fast change, if you like, when it takes time and you need a bit of patience sometimes?
So the question of how to pick the areas for research, and the person asking the question was talking about NRC as an example. I think the best way to do that is to build it on a joint vision. You first build a vision of the world to be, then you build a vision of your own potential role in that future world, and then you cover key areas of that future world with your research projects, possibly having more than one project per area. So for Nokia, we are really excited about the Internet of Things movement, which is, of course, addressed by all technology companies. There's no secrets there. But we believe that the most interesting part of that will not be the billions of connected devices, each with sensors, but the future world where we can add true intelligence on top of that through interoperable cloud services, smart analytics and big data. And basically what that means is the difference between a connected car, which you can buy today, and a self-driving car. And of course that's a huge difference of intelligence applied on top of the connected devices. And if you think of that future world, you can easily name a number of areas for research. I actually listed some of them already: low power computing, smart batteries, new types of sensors, and so forth.
Thank you, and that very much picking up on a question also on Twitter about what does the Internet of Things means to you. In this question about alliances, working with academia, you've already underlined the importance of working with policymakers and that they need to rely on you more, but how important are these alliances with academia, and how do you build them? I mean, again, partnership, innovation partnerships, a core element of the EU strategy. We talk a lot about partnership and working together. How do you make it happen, and what are the ingredients to make it really work well?
Well, what we have done is pick top universities with top research teams in a particular area, let's say material science, new types of nanomaterials in Cambridge, and then fund research teams, get our own people involved, and work with the university to expand our own knowledge in that particular area. And then you end up having a number of teams in different universities around the world supporting and feeding into our own internal research work. And that's one great way of benefiting from the university research.
And on this question of venture capital, I mean, you as a venture capitalist, the EU has taken great steps. It's been identified as one of the big challenges post-economic crisis for small and medium-sized enterprises, for startups. There has been an attempt to create a single market in venture capital. Do you think that the EU is approaching, I mean, I'm sure you'd agree with the emphasis they're putting on this, because it's in terms of helping the private sector to do it, but are they in the right direction from what you know of the EU framework for this?
Well, I think governments, both the European Commission as well as national governments, are trying to do too much. If they would just focus on incentivizing venture capital companies through easily available funding, having those venture capital companies compete against each other, and the best ones will get the next round of funding, measuring those based on the results of the portfolio company's success. That's how the market economy works. But the governments are trying to put their fingers in places that actually could work without those fingers in those places.
Interesting comment here on Twitter from Stefan Schippers. Pension funds should get incentives to invest in startups. That's the way to go. So perhaps a bigger role for pension funds than might have been envisaged before. Just in terms of that last question about what makes a good entrepreneur, what do you identify? I wanted really just to expand this. I was very struck by, you started by talking about people with passion and people who cared. What do you believe good entrepreneurs are born or made? I.e., is it nature or nurture? And if it's nurture, what creates, can you teach entrepreneurship, I suppose I'm asking in essence? Or is it something that really you've either got it or you haven't, and the job is to identify the ones who've got it? Or can we all become more entrepreneurial? What's the key to unlocking? Because it's often said Britain, the EU, has a lot of scientific knowledge, we're good at generating. It's actually the entrepreneurship that's missing, not the innovation capacity, the entrepreneurship. How do you identify them, and how do we make them, if we can?
You know, when I was raised, I had the feeling, and this was back in Finland, which was not that advanced a nation in the 70s and early 80s. My impression of an entrepreneur is somebody who fixes cars in a dirty garage because they couldn't get a real job. That was, honestly, that's how I was raised, to see entrepreneurs, and yet I became one myself. So apparently it's not nurturing as such. The passion is something that we all find in weird places. A friend of mine who got a very expensive top education, the best education one can get in technology, just became a gardener. She went into school again at the age of 40 and became a gardener, and she's so passionate about gardening. And she has become an entrepreneur, of course, because she's so passionate about that. She's no longer working at Nokia. So finding the passion is truly the key. And the reason why it's key is because, as I think von Clausewitz said some 100 plus years ago, that in war, the strategy is destroyed when the first bullet is fired, because things change immediately. And that same happens to companies and startups. When the first pitch is fired, the strategy changes because the response is not what you expected. And we need people who are so tenacious that no matter what happens, they will just continue moving forward.
So that's what you're looking for. When you're talking as a business angel, you want someone who is so determined. They've got a good idea, obviously, but they're so determined and passionate about what they do, they won't give up. But they also, and there's a contradiction, they have to be smart, but they also have to be willing to fail. They have to be risk takers, which is, if you're that passionate and you believe in something, then if it doesn't work and it comes crashing down. So you have to be, it's quite a difficult combination, isn't it, to be that passionate but also willing to fail? But you don't typically have to change your vision to something different. You just need to choose a different path to get to that vision. Right. So you're passionate about the end result, not about the path that you need to travel. Okay. Something else I wanted to ask you about, because you attracted a lot of publicity at Nokia for this, and we've talked about constant reinvention, and we've talked about, you keep saying it's about the people. That's what really makes the difference. And you have a program, Nokia, in the difficult times, you have had to lay off, make redundant a lot of people, a lot of job losses. But you created this thing called the Bridge program, which, as I understand it, helps former employees in a number of ways, either to find another job or to get training, but also crucially you provide seed funding for them to start, a group of ex-Nokia employees to get together and start something. And as I understand it, you don't take a stake. You don't have a direct commercial interest in what they do. What have you learned, again, so you're identifying among ex-employees, or are they self-identifying in that they're the ones who come forward? Do you think programs like this, if we're going to keep the skills and get people, because otherwise we lose them to the industry altogether, given that change is going to be a permanent part of the landscape, how important are programs like that? Can others copy? Again, can others copy it? Is this where policymakers can play a greater role? We have a fund for global adjustment. We have a fund to help workers adjust to changes. What have you learned from Bridge? Why did you do it? Because it sounds remarkably altruistic, and companies may sometimes be that way, but there may be some people who say, why on earth did you bother? Could you just talk us through a little bit why you did it and what you've learned from it?
Well, let me first explain what the Bridge program is all about. We have faced some challenges, as some of you know, and we have had to restructure a number of times and lay off a very large number of, too large number of people. So we wanted to support them to first of all, find a new job in Nokia, find a new job somewhere else, become entrepreneurs, get into training, or find a job in somewhere doing something completely different, for example, in NGOs. We have had 18,000 people within the program in 23 countries. Out of those 18,000, 60% have known what their next step will be before their last day in Nokia. So before they have left Nokia, they have already known what their next step will be, 60%. And I think that's a pretty good achievement. Over 1,000 new companies have been started. And based on research carried out in Finland and Denmark, after 6 to 24 months, 90% or over 90% of those companies are still in business. There's not just been a company started and then it has died away. We have provided seed funding of 25,000 euros for each entrepreneur, or up to 25,000 euros. So it has been a large investment from us, but it has generated a lot of goodwill. So our selfish reason for doing that is that all Nokia employees know that the company will ask a lot from them, but also support them when times are difficult. If we have to take the extreme act of laying people off, we will still support them and help them find the next step. We also have done this because of the values. We truly care for the people. The values are such a sort of funny thing that when the values are real, everybody will know in their guts that this is a value that we hold in high esteem, and they will act accordingly. And you don't need to talk about those values every day. You don't need to give presentations on them. And caring about our people is definitely a value that has been built into Nokia over many decades. And this is just one example of how we
Do you think others can copy it? Is this something
Absolutely.
that needs to be done by private companies, or is this one of the areas where policymakers, governments can help and help set up such schemes, or do you believe it really is that personal relationship between you and your employees and former employees that really makes it work?
Well, I think thinking like this enables people to take risks because they know that they will be supported even in the most difficult of times. And risk-taking is something where we actually became pretty bad, and many of the challenges we faced over the past few years are the result of becoming bad in taking risks earlier.
We're talking there about current employees, but there's a question here from Twitter about how does Nokia benefit student innovation, fresh talent? So that question of the skills people leave school with. And there are sometimes, obviously this has become an issue that there's been a lot of talk at European level, the skills mismatch. You've got the vacancies, you don't have the people, there are not enough young people going into science and engineering and so on. In terms of what we need to do in our schools, what do you think the key is? Are you getting, when you go out there now and look for fresh young talent, are you getting the people you need, or are you struggling to find them? And what are you doing, and what can companies like yours do in relationship to fostering that talent, that innovation, while people are still in education as opposed to afterwards?
I faced a very challenging audience about a year ago when I was talking to some 500 principals of Finnish schools, and I was talking to them, how can they teach entrepreneurship? And many of you don't know anything about the Finnish educational system, but our teachers have two characteristics that really define them. One is that they are the top students at the high school, really the top straight A students. It's so difficult to become a teacher in Finland because the top students, many of them want to become teachers. And the second thing is that they are the most risk-averse people you can find. So the top A risk-averse students become teachers. So how do you teach these risk-avoiding people to teach entrepreneurship? And I told them that you guys are experts in teaching. You have the tools in your hands, and you will figure out a way to teach entrepreneurship as long as you understand what entrepreneurship means. And then you use that tool set, that toolbox, and you can teach it. One thing that I also suggested to them that they should teach, which very few countries do at the moment, is basically plain logical thinking, sort of the rules of logic. In Finland, we have 2 levels of math that students can learn, a lower level and a higher level, and many choose the lower level. And I think they would more likely choose the higher level if at the very early years they would be just taught not math, but what does logic mean. And you can use simple computer programs and programming languages to teach logic. Because basically computer programs are all about instructions and logic. I have tried this with my own kids and a number of other kids who didn't care at all for computers, and it's a wonder how much passion they find when they start learning, and in how many ways they can apply that learning for understanding the basics of logic.
Okay, we'll take if there are any, a last few questions from the room, and then I want to try and draw some conclusions from our discussion. Does anybody, I see one, hang on, I'm going to come round to you because I think I'm nearest to you. So can you put your hand up again so I can find you? Thank you very much, madam. Here I come. I get very fit doing this, ladies and gentlemen. It's terribly good for me. Please.
Hello, thank you. My name is Julia Rovsen. I would like to pick up on one of the key words from our session, leader and leadership. I lived almost 10 years in Finland. I have heard a lot of interesting anecdotes about Nokia circulating there, and one of them was that a young guy is sharing 1 year after working in Nokia his experiences with the friends. And the friends ask, how is it? Do you like your boss? How is it to work in Nokia? And he says, well, after 1 year I suspect 5 of them to be my bosses. I would like to ask, how do you think it is important in the corporate world to develop a leadership skills of your employees, or is it better to let such people go and set up their own company?
Thank you. Very good question, that. Madam.
Thank you. My name is Gabrielle and I work for Think Young. We're a think tank that focuses on lobbying for young people. And my question is very much coming back to R&D. So we're saying we should increase the amount of R&D we do, so the research and development, but I'm seeing very much a lack of implementation after this research. So I want to kind of ask you, how do you see these things and being implemented once we have researched them, and how do you see young people as a part of this innovation that is so necessary in today's corporations?
Thank you very much indeed. And there's one there, if you could take the mic there. Thank you, madam.
10 years ago, everybody in this room would have had Nokia phones, that's sure.
Yeah.
Nokia was the first to develop tablets. They were the first to have also this music supported by third party, just like it was not Apple. So what happened? You said you avoid taking risk maybe, and in the beginning you said that we should not be blaming anybody for failure, but what happened? You know, you had the innovation, but didn't make it to the market.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's come back on that because that links to what we were just talking about with the bridge programme and so on. I'll take one more, please, sir.
You mentioned passion and logic and knowledge, but what about wisdom for a great leader?
Okay, I think he's taking for granted that if there is no wisdom, it won't happen. But, Risto, if you could come back, those tough years when it didn't quite go so well, what went wrong and what did you learn from it?
Well, let me first just quickly say about this story told about Nokia, 5 bosses in 1 year and so forth, and you mentioned that it's better to let people go and become entrepreneurs. I think letting people go is always the failure of the leadership. It's a complete failure to get into a situation where you have to let people go. Just, I want to make that point. However, when you are in that situation, you can't wait because you are scared. Then you just need to act to enable the company to survive and grow again. What happened to Nokia? There's an interesting book written by Jim Collins, who wrote the From Good to Great. Many of you have read that. He also wrote a book called How the Mighty Fall. I would recommend you all to read that. It's actually a pretty good analysis of what can happen to leaders in different industries. And I'll only mention one thing here about what happened to Nokia. It's not that Nokia started doing the wrong things. It's that Nokia continued doing the right thing for too long. And basically what I mean with that, and this is not the whole answer, but this is a major part of the answer. When Nokia started with mobile phones, they were very hardware-centric. And software was an important ingredient, but it was sort of an afterthought. It's added to the hardware. And of course the world changed completely around Nokia to a place where a platform is software. It's an operating system, and the core competitiveness of the product is based on that platform. While Nokia continued operating based on the model where each new device was the king, and it dictated what the software had to do. And the software never became a platform in the sense that that's the core, that's the center of how things are organized. The hardware was the center. Each device was its own center, and then everything was around it. And the owner of that device was the king who called the shots. The guy who owned the software was not even a prince. So we continued doing the same old thing, which was a good thing in its time, just too long. But read the book. It's a very interesting book.
Okay, thank you. And how then does a company know when it's time to stop doing the right thing and do something else? Because if it's going well, then you say, well, this is great, let's keep going. Yeah. How do you know when to switch?
And the funny thing is that financially things continue going really well long after your competitiveness is already sliding down very rapidly. So when I joined the Nokia board, I came in as an entrepreneur. I came in as an entrepreneur whose main business was also supplying Nokia and other device manufacturers with software. And I had experienced firsthand how impossible it is to write software for the Nokia devices. And obviously from that point of view, what should have been done or would need to be done was pretty obvious. But of course that's only one point of view. And we need people who have these points of view, and they need to be listened to.
Yeah.
But how do you do that when the company is the best in the world? It's number one on all rankings, and its profits are rising, and it's such a difficult challenge for leaders. And again, this How the Mighty Fall book talks about that challenge. And it's good reading for every company that is growing rapidly and becoming more and more profitable, and that is very successful. Because that's the moment when you need to be more paranoid than ever before.
Okay, and a word, if you would, on leadership skills in companies, and linking that really to the question about young people, and we've talked about the implementation of research in the sense of crossing that valley of death, but how do you develop those leadership skills? How do people become like you and your young employees? How do you develop the skills that will enable them to become the CEOs of the future? And do you do it within the company, or do you say, let's turn them into great leaders so they go out in the world and start their own business? Presumably, that doesn't make business sense for Nokia. You need to keep them in-house.
Leadership is one of those qualities that are elusive, difficult to define. I believe that all great leaders have great self-knowledge. They understand themselves pretty well. They understand their weaknesses and they understand their strengths, and they are comfortable with both. So they can talk about their weaknesses as well. And that enables them to take feedback. And I think for development, getting honest feedback is the key thing. So, for example, as chairman, I have introduced into all the companies where I have been chairman a process of having 360 reviews for the board members. And this is typically a huge shock for board members, because board members don't expect to be evaluated. They don't expect to be graded. They are sort of too elevated for that. And then I tell them that you'll all rate your colleagues, But we'll also ask the management team to do anonymous rating of every one of you. So we get a 360 result for the board members.
And then it's your job to tell them what the results are. I'd like to be a fly on the wall in one of those meetings.
Or if they're really bad, then I'll hire a consultant to do that.
We are almost out of time, but I just want to try and draw some conclusions from this before we close. You warned earlier of the risk that Europe could become a museum for visiting Chinese tourists. If there was one thing of all the issues we've discussed, and I want to answer this both from a policy perspective but also from an industrial perspective, one priority for you, among the many issues that have been raised by you and by our audience, to ensure that we do not become a museum, that we do innovate, that we do become and remain world leaders in key areas and emulate the successes of Nokia in the past, what for you would be the priority? And I'd like you, please, as I say, one, yes, for policymakers, and I think you've made it pretty clear where you are on that, but also for the industry itself, for the telecom sector, if you like, or more broadly, for Europe's industries to make sure that we don't suffer the fate that you fear.
There's a great entrepreneur in Japan, Masayoshi Son, who started SoftBank. And he has a 300-year strategy for his company. Of course, he joined the competition of who can put the biggest number behind the strategy. But if you read that, and I recommend you to read it, it actually has some significant insights. And when you look far enough ahead, sort of everyday pains of today become pretty meaningless. And you can focus on the really important things, and it's easier to give up something. So what I talked about earlier, if every single European country wants to keep everything that it has, all its independence, all the benefits, all the structures, all the regulation that it has intact, we'll never move forward. So we all need to be prepared to give up as well. By the way, do you know how many pages of regulation there is in Finland? All the laws, all the EU regulations, everything that is mandatory for Finnish companies and citizens. It's 182,000 pages. And I think in bigger countries, the number is likely bigger. And the Commission and the Parliament here are churning out new regulations all the time. Who can even read through 182,000 pages of regulation rather than understand it? So just by over-regulating ourselves, we are also slowing ourselves down. So take the long view, be ready to give up something and allow the market to function.
Okay, and for industry?
I think the same applies to industry as well. Companies need to be able to give up something as well in order to gain something.
Okay, and on that note, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking Risto Siilasmaa very much indeed. Thank you so much. We called this the Global Leaders Session. You see an example there of the sort of leadership that is taking Nokia into its new future. Thank you very much again to you, Risto. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to those who tweeted questions. It's time for a break now. Lunch will be served and the next sessions